Hi everyone and welcome to this Innovating for Good Google Hangout. I'm Chris Ernie, co-lead for UNHCR Innovation. Innovating for Good is a monthly Google Hangout series hosted by UNHCR Innovation and SocialGood that's meant to spark conversations on innovation in the humanitarian sector. Each Hangout carries its own topic. This is our first Hangout for 2016. We're very excited that we're opening the season with Dan, Lesley and Andrew, and we'll be broadcasting every month with new topics on innovating for good. To start off with, I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Dan McClure. He is the lead Innovation Design Initiatives at Thoughtworks. Lesley Bourns, Humanitarian Affairs Officer, Policy Analysis and Innovation Section for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Andrew Billo, also a Humanitarian Affairs Officer, also in the Policy Analysis and Innovation Section, also with UN OCHA. Today's discussion focuses on how the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, change the role of humanitarian innovation, and will deepen the conversation. So the discussion started on a blog post that Dan actually wrote. After reading Dan's blog post, it sounds like our role as advocates for innovation is going to not only get harder, but more crucial to the work we do. So how do the SDGs change the role of humanitarian innovation? Now, before we jump into the conversation, if you're following the conversation, make sure you use hashtag #InnOvForGood on Twitter and to tweet our panelists your questions. Now, Andrew, as background, can you give us a quick overview of the SDGs that were adopted last year?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks to your efforts in hosting this. So as some of our viewers may be aware, a new set of Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September 2015. This is a comprehensive set of goals intended to really address every aspect of human development with the purpose of leaving no one behind. In order to be comprehensive, we, I think, need to look at new ways of interacting. We need to look beyond sort of the traditional silos that exist within the humanitarian space in order for us to be more inclusive. So as I mentioned there are 17 goals. Goal number 9 specifically references innovation. That said, I think there are opportunities throughout this sustainable development agenda to focus on innovation and the opportunities that innovation presents in terms of addressing what is increasingly a growing needs gap in terms of responding to growing humanitarian challenges all over the world. So recognizing, I think, that we are in this period where challenges are rising, we need this comprehensive agenda for bringing the international community, local actors, national actors, regional actors all together in this unified and comprehensive space, so that we all work together to address these challenges. So maybe I'll leave it just there, and we can get into some of the more specifics around innovation and how innovation relates to this set of SDGs, as well as how this relates to the report that Lesley and my colleagues worked on last year.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks very much, Andrew. Actually, I wanted to start with the Leaving No One Behind report, if I can, Lesley. Can you explain the report for those of the audience who haven't read or seen it, and just elaborate on what the big messages are being made in that report?
Sure. So the study was a 2-year process to look at what does humanitarian effectiveness mean in today's world. So people who are living in crisis are facing different circumstances than they were at the time when the agency we work for was founded, and certainly when UNHCR was founded. It's a different environment in terms of conflict, displacement, a lot of the things that drive crises today. So just to look at a few of the factors, there are more needs than there were, let's say, 25 years ago, if we use when OCHA was founded as a kind of benchmark. We look at estimates of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, around 114 million, I think, in 2015. That's almost 3 times as many as 10 years prior. And we also know that crises are lasting for longer. So, Chris, with your focus on refugees, you'll know that The latest examination of displacement and refugees shows that people are displaced for an average of 17 years. So really, these are generational periods of crisis and displacement. And I think that another factor that we look at is just overall vulnerability, because crises are more complex. There are a lot of different factors working at the same time. We have climate change, leaving people really vulnerable to risks in relation to natural disasters. We have rapid urbanization that's usually not planned, leaving people often the poorest in areas where they may not have housing. And so these factors come together to leave people in high rates of vulnerability that just were not true, decades ago when the system was created. So what does it mean to be effective in that kind of environment? And I think the fact that the study is entitled Leaving No One Behind is obviously not a coincidence, because looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the most critical things that they do that's new is they make a commitment. The member states uniformly came together in this agenda and said, we're going to talk about displaced people, we're going to talk about refugees, we'll talk about people in conflict, and we'll commit not to leave them out of a future of development that shows prosperity and security for everyone. And that was really a new commitment from member states that didn't happen in previous sets of goals. So that presents an opening for humanitarians to think a little bit differently about what they can achieve and who we can partner with across some of our old divides to bring those most vulnerable people who we work really closely with out of crises and into a slipstream of development to face better prospects. So the study came out with 5 main messages about what we need to do differently to think about this new kind of success that doesn't just meet needs in the short term, but really tries to think about how we can connect people in crisis to better long-term prospects. The first recommendation was to what we called reinforce and don't replace. So because humanitarians often think in the short-term response kind of approach, we tend to set up our own systems and try to meet needs in the short term, but sometimes those parallel systems will linger for a lot longer than we'd like because crises last for so long. So the message around that was to say, look at what exists nationally, locally, and at a community level and find out how you can really reinforce that. The second area which we described was enter with an exit, and what we mean by that isn't, try to get out before you really get in, but to say, think about how you can create the conditions for people when you begin to engage as an international actor, that you can get out fairly quickly. So rather than thinking about building up your own structure and delivery models, think about really how to shift that investment to a kind of place where you can then responsibly leave and people will have resources. And that's really a place where development and humanitarian link up quite strongly, because if you think about creating the situation where people are food secure or who have access to food, you don't have to think about food delivery, right? The third area was talking about leveraging comparative advantage. And there we just mean we can't look at our own humanitarian community to meet these needs. The scale is too great, the crises last for too long, and our resources, relatively speaking, are still too small. So what's out there in the private sector, and we'll all have a lot to say, I think, about that in the innovation space, but even with military and diaspora and other networks that have a lot to bring to these challenges. The humanitarians aren't always at the center of response. Sometimes we're supporting it. And then the fourth and fifth really kind of connect to each other. The fourth is we talked about seeing the whole picture of need. So not beginning with a kind of supply-driven response where we say, here's what we've got, and now you can have it, but rather better understanding what people's needs are, and then being accountable to them, right? So really, there's a lot of talk about accountability and kind of even at the highest levels, people talking about wanting to be more directly accountable to affected people. There's very little invested in it, and we've seen very few concrete results of that. So how can we do that differently? So I've presented a lot there, but that's what the results of this study essentially found.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Lesley. I wanted to ask actually. You've touched on it. I wanted to be quite explicit on what makes these concepts particularly important. Now, none of the things that we've been speaking about are particularly new, I don't think, as concepts. But why are they so important now?
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of these messages are familiar for humanitarians and for governments who've been talking about these issues. I think it's important partly because of the external factors that I pointed to. there's simply people who are in need who are not being reached. And the system is either maybe reaching them with something that they don't necessarily, isn't their first priority, or is not necessarily meeting their most essential need. So there's a sort of essential humanitarian question about how we actually rise to the challenge today, and that urgency is even greater. I think there's this sort of big picture political opportunity here with the Sustainable Development Goals to shift people's thinking about it's not enough for someone to live in displacement for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years without access to jobs or schools or some more sustainable prospect. And so that's really a kind of game-changing moment for humanitarians to link up to that. And then also we have the World Humanitarian Summit this year in May in Istanbul, and that's a place where I think donors are considering whether they may need to change some of their funding kind of approaches to support some different outcomes and results. So there's a lot of momentum around some ideas that maybe we've been talking about for a long time, and now a lot of practice too. People on the ground aren't waiting for governments or donors to make commitments. They're also experimenting with some of these new approaches. So we've learned a lot about what actually works.
Thank you. And when we've been looking at this report, I wanted to segue into innovation. So I wanted to ask Dan. You've read the report. You've got a lot to say specifically about innovation and the humanitarian sphere. How does this report tie back to innovation? What's the connection? What are we looking for?
So it's been interesting. For a long time, innovation in the humanitarian space was largely piggybacking on concepts of innovation that were developed in the commercial space. So, we got good at mastering ideas like lean startup, fail fast, MVPs, etc. And that's very good innovation if you're trying to fix a part of an existing system. If you're going to try to add a new piece in a process for logistics, or you're going to try to fix a specific small problem. What the report really points out is that the problems that we're trying to fix now are not small, isolated, narrowly defined problems, that they're actually deep ecosystem problems in the affected communities. And if we're going to shift from being simply providing aid, which provides us a multitude of small problems to solve, to being one of where we're trying to build resilience, build self-sufficiency, we've got to solve a harder type of problem. And that is interesting because we're actually not very good at it. The tools and techniques we have for solving complex ecosystem building type problems, innovating in complexity, are just beginning to emerge. And what was exciting for me about the report was it both sort of posed a challenge of like, here's a harder set of problems to solve, you innovators, go try to do something hard for a change. And then at the same time, it offered a set of tools that really can be connected up and act as a model for how to approach these types of hard problems. So, Chris, if I could just maybe take Lesley's 5 things that she had laid out earlier and put them in a slightly different order. What's interesting is they become actually an innovation methodology. So let's start with the idea that you're going to have a 360-degree view of the problem. And this is the idea that we're not going to try to treat a complex problem as something that can be scoped down or oversimplified, that we actually have to embrace and recognize the complexity. So we start by recognizing we have a hard problem. She then lays out a model that basically says, and we have to have an exit strategy for us to finish this innovation. And this is a big part of innovating in complexity. You can't take small segments of the problem. You have to basically see how the whole system is going to look at the end, so that you're essentially evolving from one ecosystem to another. The 3 other items in the process then provide some guidelines for how to do that evolution. 1, that you evolve, that you don't replace. So this isn't a case of throw out an old ecosystem and then bring in a new one. It's how do we evolve ecosystems. The second is that you need a diverse group of players and capabilities in order to do complex innovation. And the third is that this evolution is driven by testing and learning, testing and learning. So this comes back from our old lean startup methodologies, but it's applied to a much bigger and much harder problem. And it's kind of exciting because I think this provides both a bigger mission and some tools for approaching that bigger mission from an innovation perspective.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. I think I wanted to dive into those 3 points. I've been working in the humanitarian innovation space for the last 3.5 to 4 years. I've definitely learned a lot about how the industry is to evolve, how the industry has opened up to diversity, and really how we've started to not only embrace learning and testing, but actually to recognize that we have been learning and testing for quite a long time. In any case, we have more formalized structures. We have we've certainly learned a lot from the commercial sector. We have piggybacked indeed, and now I think we're at a stage where across the industry we really have started to develop our own methods for innovating, whether it's UNHCR, whether it's UNICEF, whether it's WFP, Danish Refugee Council, Norwegian Refugee Council, and so on and so forth, local NGOs, volunteer groups, of which we see a plethora across Europe at the moment. But I wanted to ask Lesley in particular. You work in OCHA, so you have a very unique view of the humanitarian sphere. So I wanted to ask you your views on the humanitarian innovation space, how you see that it's changed, and let's just give an arbitrary span of the last 5 years, if I may. Over to you.
I think I actually may ask Andrew to answer that question on just humanitarian innovation, since he's our focal point on that issue. But I can just say a couple of things about what the study says on innovation in particular, and kind of where it fits in relation to effectiveness. I'm going to try to share my screen so you can all see this image from the study, which shows what some of the elements are around effectiveness. And you'll see within this pyramid, at the top we talk about the results that we think that effectiveness, what does it look like? What do crisis-affected people have a right to at the end of the day? What is success? And then in the middle, these blue squares are trying to describe how we should be working in a way to deliver those results. And one of those we describe as being nimble. And to me, that's really our being able to adapt as a system to different contexts, to changing needs, to new players in the system and the benefits that they may bring. So that to me is really a lot of what innovation is meant to bring to the system, or what innovation supports is that nimbleness. And then in the bottom we have a set of enablers, and these are the things that we need to have in any environment to allow for good practice and good results. And one of those is information and evidence, and there we just talk about research and development on issues, testing and building a case for what works. And so I think that's where in the study we really touch on those issues. But maybe Andrew can talk a little bit more about how the system has changed its view on innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris, for the question. I mean, I think if we look, say, 5 years prior to now, I think the humanitarian innovation space was much less professional. I mean, as OCHA, with a role in coordinating across the system, we obviously are trying to keep an eye on what is happening in different spaces, and I think there's really been a proliferation of innovative products, certainly, across the system, but too often those products fail to be scaled up. So there's a lot of seed funding available, for example, to support the development of innovation, but when it comes to scaling and some of these more complicated ecosystem challenges that require all actors to be involved in terms of developing solutions, that's been a gap for us so far. I think another big change is a recognition of the role of partners in this space, in particular the private sector, as was alluded to previously. I think you know, and this is still very much the case, that the private sector is too often viewed as sort of the boogeyman in this space, that it's difficult to work with them. They don't understand humanitarian principles, that they have to be watched carefully. But I think the reality is more that they present a lot of opportunities, and of course humanitarians have a set of standards, you know, professional code of ethics. We have principles that we follow that are, you know, deeply important to the work that we do for a whole range of reasons, and it's important that we communicate what those are. But that said, I think the private sector also has capacities, especially in the innovation space, that far exceed or outstrip what we're able to do alone. So I think in those two areas, both professionalism in terms of standardizing our approach with respect to innovation, there are initiatives that, as I said, try to bring the different actors within the ecosystem together to work more closely. And then secondly, with respect to partnerships, I think that's also an area where we're really benefiting from increased engagement on the part of the private sector. And as Lesley mentioned, the World Humanitarian Summit coming up in May in Istanbul presents a great opportunity for us to showcase how some of these partnerships have functioned in practice, and also to foster new partnerships going forward.
Chris, could I jump in here with an observation on partnerships?
Of course you can. I was about to ask you a question on that in any case, so you go ahead. Your answer to your own question would probably be better than the answer to my question, because your question would be better. So go for it.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about innovation is that, just as sort of a rule of thumb, it benefits from a diverse group of players or people involved. But in many cases, as innovation gets deployed into the sector, new types of potential partners emerge. So I'm thinking like cash programming actually opens the door to not only the usual idea of who a commercial partner could be, but many types of other players that we haven't even thought of as potential participants in the humanitarian sector. So in some ways, innovation changes the playing field on which innovation is done.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, the question I was actually going to put to you was related to the type of private sector organisations that we commonly link with humanitarian innovation. There have been some key partners, at least for UNHCR. The OCHA Foundation was a really notable partner in the establishment of the team. Dan, I wanted to come back to you actually and dig into. I mean, we're talking very much as humanitarians and adopting partnerships with the private sector. I wondered, you sit on this intersection between private sector and humanitarian actors such as OCHA, such as UNHCR. Is there a difference in opinion or perception of the humanitarian sphere that you've noticed from dare I say the other side, from private sector to actors?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those cases where to lump the private sector together into a single box is to put too many different types of animal in one arc. That being said, I would say the differences that I see are less about humanitarian sector versus not humanitarian sector perceptions, and rather perceptions about what innovation is really about, how it's done. I think in many cases, private sector innovation tends to be very product-oriented, very specific to sort of market-driven forces, and as a result, they take a lot of thoughts and means out of that general approach, which maybe don't map as well. The thing that I find exciting about the humanitarian sector is it's one of the few places that I find that as a mission is talking about this big complex ecosystem change. In essence, the humanitarian sector is trying to do what Uber did in the commercial space of really build out a complex set of different interconnected things that all work together. Now, not saying that I support Uber as a business model, but as an idea that they changed multiple things that all had to work together in order to achieve their goal. I think that's the kind of innovation that the humanitarian sector is increasingly well positioned to take on.
Brilliant, thanks Dan. That was a a very comprehensive answer. I wanted to respond, or at least put a question to Lesley that we've received from Twitter. So I wanted to bring our audience into the discussion. So the question is to you, Lesley, what role can developing economies or nations play in the pursuit of humanitarian innovation? And this is from Devangana Koka.
Okay. Well, I think in relation to the study, I mean, if I look at some of the shifts that we're talking about, there are plenty of developing nations and less resourced partners who are taking up really leading roles in a lot of these areas. So this is not just for environments that are stable or well-resourced. There are a lot of places where, for example, the Africa Risk Capacity, which some of you may know about, is a public-private partnership insurance scheme with the African Union and several different African countries to look at how they can basically have access to insurance for things that they know are high-risk issues for them, such as food insecurity. And so there you have countries that maybe are, through a combination of loans or their own budget line investments, essentially establishing a social safety net for their own people. And bringing in private sector to look at risk and look at how risk can be reduced, and sort of incentivizing other actors to get engaged in stabilizing and limiting risk in those places. And so that's one of those examples where that has a dramatic result for an individual who's living in a really high-risk environment, who maybe annually is facing drought conditions or flood conditions that disrupt their life. So this is not just something that's happening in richer nations. It's really happening at the lead of people all over the place.
Thanks very much, Lesley, and also thanks very much to Devangana for the excellent question. We've got another question from James Leon Dufour from UNHCR. He works in the Europe winter cell, as it happens. So his question is on innovation and what does disruption mean in humanitarian innovation? I'm going to ask Dan if you would be able to answer that question. So yeah. What does disruption mean?
So I think disruption is really one of the key things that we're looking for when we talk about complex innovation. And that disruption is really the rules that you worked by before no longer work. So you're essentially changing the underlying ways that an entire group of people or entire system works together. And what that basically means is, from the standpoint of being able to, simply improve something, that's not a disruptive innovation. When you have a disruptive innovation, you've changed the underlying way that something works. And so, for example, improving the logistics of food delivery is not disruptive. On the other hand, the introduction of cash, which fundamentally changes the way that the dynamics of aid work with an affected population, that is disruptive because it changes the underlying rules. Andrew, do you have a variation on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would just add to that is I think there's a risk within the innovation space of us chasing sort of the low-hanging fruit options. I think some of the big picture change that Dan spoke to, sometimes I think for the sort of innovation corner, can feel insurmountable. So there's this whole question about, are we innovating for the sake of innovation and improving innovation within the system, or are we innovating for the broader humanitarian landscape? And I think there's a risk of us sort of falling back on responding to technical challenges or putting forward technical solutions when what is really required is more of an adaptive change, as Dan alluded to, through the system. And that's obviously much harder, but I think because of sort of the way the incentives are lined up within the system, the relationship between donors, between UN agencies, NGOs, there can be sort of a self-reinforcing system where we're all looking for answers, we're all looking for solutions, and sometimes pursuing the big challenges that Dan alluded to make us more vulnerable, essentially, to the possibility of failure and not being able to present a solution. So I think that's a serious risk, for the innovation sector. I mean, in terms of what the big picture long-term objectives are versus getting sort of quick wins that are easily presentable, easily digestible to this community, so that we end up looking, good and positive ourselves. And that's maybe a natural and understandable challenge that we have to address, but I think it's very real. And if we are looking to make these sort of system changes, then we need to be comfortable with the possibility of a long-term approach, and also one that risks the possibility of failure.
So just as a quick observation, one of the flags I think that you've got disruptive innovation is that existing players are in some way threatened or undermined in the things that they're most comfortable doing.
Maybe
Sure.
if I could come in on that point, Dan, I don't want to interrupt you, but just on that point about what is positive disruption in the humanitarian space, I think if we use the cash example, what's disruptive about it is not just that it disrupts the delivery system that we're used to using around logistics and financing, but that it also disrupts, it allows the individual recipient to be fully empowered to make his or her own decisions, right? So it disrupts that whole structure of a kind of hierarchy around saying, well, actually what we have is food or housing or this or that, and this is what you're going to get. And so that really changes, I think, in a very positive way, who's in charge of what happens with assistance.
And if I could throw out one more flag, is that new things that weren't possible before suddenly become possible. So going to your point of, as soon as you start empowering people to make those choices, you also empower more people to contribute and be a part of the supply side of that. And so there's just a whole new set of dynamics that weren't possible before that become possible in a disruptive change. And so that's one of the flags.
I'm also, and this is more for myself, and back to you, Dan, with this question, I'm afraid. I'm interested in the culture of the humanitarian organisations and how open they are to disruptive innovations. I wondered what you'd observed with. I don't want to say outside looking in, because you're definitely not, but you have a very, very unique perspective on innovation in the humanitarian sphere. So I wanted to get your perspective. How do you understand organizations in terms of their readiness to be disrupted, their readiness to have their cultures changed through innovation?
So the observation I would make is there's almost no organization anywhere that's ready to be disrupted, whether that's in the humanitarian space or the commercial sector, because disruption is really hard and basically invalidates a lot of things. That being said, most disruption is driven by small groups of people, is driven by people who act as a choreographer or an insurgent. And I think the humanitarian sector is developing a really nice crew of those sorts of folks in many different agencies. So it's sort of like you can't wait for the organization to feel okay about being disrupted, but you can create the people that do it. And I think a lot has been done in that regard.
Excellent. And I think that's a really good point that I wanted to pick up on. No organization is exactly, whether you're a humanitarian UN agency or maybe a corporate sector actor, and I think it is very true that across the humanitarian organisations we are starting to develop that group of people who are definitely labelled within their own agencies as disruptors, 9 times out of 10. I wanted to dig into. We've got a question from Nana. Who's asking what methods or tools of risk assessment are used in humanitarian innovation? And Andrew, I think this is probably one for you.
Sure. I mean, I think risk assessment, I mean, with respect to innovation, presents a lot of opportunity. Frankly, the proliferation of technological innovation, I think, can be applied in a range of field settings. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a big opportunity. I mean, I don't work specifically in risk per se, but I think in terms of the analysis that we do in the field, our ability to collect data to understand macro level trends, to make sense of a lot of different data sources, especially in areas where we may not have full access. For example, you could look at Libya or Syria as examples. We're trying to make sense of a lot of information that's coming in from the field, to both collect and to analyze that information, and there are powerful tools that now exist for that analysis. And I think that is one way, certainly, that innovative technology can contribute to reducing risk, so that we have a better sense of what's happening on the ground in very challenging environments.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So let's talk practicalities. If we're going to start a project today, what would be our first step? I'm putting this to the three of you, and the bravest person will be the one who answers first.
So I'll make a first pass at it and then throw it over. I think the big thing that I would say here is to start by learning a whole lot. Robin Mays did an interesting study called Valuing What Works, where she went and looked at top performing people for ICRC and the folks on the ground, and what she found was those top performers spent an enormous amount of time actually learning about the ecosystem, building a deep insight into the complexity of what they were trying to influence before they actually began influencing.
Okay, so learn an awful lot. I see some nodding coming from Lesley, which can only mean that you've got something to add.
I think I'm maybe saying it in a different way, but I think also who's already doing it. So what can you build on that's working well? Where are the gaps? So what's really the problem that you're trying to solve, and who are your partners in doing it? So I think one of the things we talk about is that we have improved a lot on how we do humanitarian assessment, but we still don't sit together with development partners and maybe peace-building partners and environmentalists working in the same space to have more of a joint problem statement. And what does that look like? So for us, it's also the starting point should be thinking differently about who's at the table to map what's already happening. But I agree with Dan that the problem statement and really getting that right and taking the time to get it right is the starting point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in a way, it goes without saying, but affected people need to be part of that conversation. And I think getting back to some of the tools that we have available, we can increasingly engage people in platforms and discussions. The proliferation of smartphones, telecommunication technology allows us to really get insights, even if it's in a virtual space, as to what people's needs are on the ground. And too often, I think we've moved ahead without really considering what those needs actually are.
I think there's one other thing that's interesting about this is that we tend to think about learning as something that you do at the beginning of the project to get the project right, and then you go do the project. Like you could, put blinders on and just execute once you've got the rightness done. This whole idea of evolving ecosystems implies that there's a continual learning, a continual testing process going on, and that it's a very complex testing. It's not simply, are we improving reading levels? It's, what about the rest of the ecosystem? Have we built the kind of culture that it stimulates teachers to be appropriately adopted? So I think this whole idea that it's a continual learning process, a continual engagement with partners, is something that's a little bit different than, we set up our goals and then we measure against them.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. I wanted to dig into again the 5 points of the report that we were talking about earlier. And Dan, you mentioned diversity. I'm really interested in the way that we engage with private sector organisations. I'm really interested in the diversity within the private sector, and I'm also quite conscious of some of the larger partnerships that are cited as being successful partnerships around innovation. We can talk about great partnerships with the UPS Foundation or with you know, name a large software company who we'd like to learn from and work with their core competencies. I'm really interested in how we can work with medium-sized organizations, or indeed small-sized organizations from the private sector. I'm not sure if anybody's managed to kind of crack that nut yet, but we've definitely over at UNHCR started to really be quite strategic in terms of the core competencies that we want to co-create with, or we want to collaborate with around projects. Dan, have you got any insights as to how large or indeed small humanitarian organizations can start to engage medium and smaller size organizations from the private sector?
Yeah, so Thoughtworks, where I'm from, is probably in that medium-sized organization. And maybe I'll start by saying, from our perspective, we've been shifting our focus on how we engage with the humanitarian sector. Earlier on, it was sort of like, we'll provide services. So you need a computer developer, we'll provide you a computer developer. More recently, we've really been focusing on how can we be more strategic. I think that becomes the real question, is what do you want the private sector folks to do for you and with you? If you want them to simply provide services, then I think in some ways that becomes a business model question. You know, can you find an acceptable way of compensation, that works for them? I think the more interesting question, though, is this question of how do you become more of a strategic partner with these firms? And for that, I think you need to establish, and what we've seen work in, I think, some of the more benchmark cases where innovation has really been driven forward by collaborations, longer-term partnerships where you've got an ongoing engagement and an ongoing relationship. And oftentimes the humanitarian sector funding models and engagement models aren't real well set up for that. So I think, you know, moving towards that, being friends for a long time, is probably one of the biggest first steps.
Great, thanks for that, Dan. From our own experience over here, I definitely can't stress enough the importance of setting those expectations from very clearly from the very beginning of any sort of partnership, and then reevaluating them as you move as really part of the learning and testing process of an innovation methodology. So I wanted to ask Lesley and Dan another question, and I wanted to go back to something that was mentioned earlier, which is accountability. Accountability to affected populations, and I wanted to tease out the link between innovation methodologies and that accountability piece that seems to really be emerging in importance at the moment. So I wanted to turn it over to you guys at OCHA and ask if you had any insights into how innovation methodologies, innovation projects have the potential to increase accountability to affected populations. So Lesley or Andrew, either one of you, it'd be great to get an answer from you.
Maybe I'll start just from the view of the study and our recommendation, and then Andrew will know more technically what that means. But we talked about this need for shared accountability, and I think the difference between maybe what some previous discussions about accountability look like and this is that what we're saying is we really want accountability for outcomes. So not just to say, I said I would deliver this and I delivered it, but to in fact together say, we're going to make this change in someone's work toward a change in legal status or mobility or security of housing or security of food over the long term. And that's something that, as Dan pointed out, if you do continuous measurement, you'll need to keep adapting it. But that continuous feedback with people, I think, is one element of the accountability, that it's ongoing and that it drives what your direction looks like over time. And I think the other part of it is that it has to be linked to decision making. So you can't just have an accountability unit that sits out in the outside and is saying, we're getting this feedback and isn't it great, we're all talking. Yeah. It has to feed back up to what are the decision-making structures in a humanitarian country team, in a specific agency, or for an NGO, what that looks like on the ground, and back to donors. this is what your money's doing or not, and we're all accountable for this. So I think those two parts, that it's continuous and it drives design and adaptation, and that it's linked to decision making around really kind of outcomes that have an impact on people's lives. I think that's what could look different about accountability in the model we put forward.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what Dan has to say. I mean, especially on principles like user-centered design and some of this design-based thinking that I think is appropriate in this context.
So first, I was doing thumbs up throughout everything that Lesley said. I think the big shift here, as far as evidence-based work in innovation goes, is historically there was a tendency to view evidence-based as, did this work or not? Did we get what we paid for, basically? It was a success measure. Using evidence as a design tool and to continually adjust and refine the design, to me, is the really big transition that goes on here. It's funny, Andrew, you mentioned user-centered design, and while I believe user-centered design is a useful tool in that it engages with communities, I think it often is approached in a much too simplistic way. Do you want a blue button or do you want a red button? Would you like an iPad or would you, and when in reality the kinds of insights that you need are much deeper. What's the relationship between families here? What's the power dynamics in this village? And those sorts of things often fall short of what the user-centered design sort of common base practices are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Dan. I was going to actually going to pose a question on the right product or the right system being developed. Doesn't always mean that you have happy end users, but I don't think we've got time for that right now, which is probably just as well. So what I wanted to say very, very quickly before we start to wrap up is previously Lesley was presenting. Lesley was making a presentation. We weren't able to see the screen share, unfortunately, but the study has a microsite, Humanitarian 360. Where any of the audience can find out more on the ideas, on the issues that we've been speaking about. I also wanted to thank the panel for taking the time to discuss this these issues on this Google Hangout. It's been great that we've had some audience participation. We always want more, so please do feel free to carry on sending in questions in the next Google Hangout. I wanted to thank the panel, Dan, Lesley, and Andrew, for joining us today. You've been great. Thank you also to the viewers and people on social media engaging with us. That goes without saying. If you do have more thoughts, we encourage you to continue the discussion on Twitter. This Hangout is also going to be available online on YouTube. So on 2 different YouTube channels, the SocialGood YouTube channel and the UNHCR Innovation YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Chris Ernie. I'm the co-lead of UNHCR Innovation.